Palestinian press office was closed in Nablus. No reporting of that, although the New York Times took the occasion of the closing of the Nablus press office to write one of Thomas Friedman's regular odes to freedom of the press in Israel. Well, that tells you how much we care about freedom of the press. In fact, if Nicaragua were to follow the standards of U.S. clients, the whole the Prensa would never have been published in the first place. The editors would either have been murdered or cut to pieces. The thing would have been blown up, or certainly they would have been expelled or jailed or something like that. So that answers our question. That tells us that the civil libertarian passions are as serious, maybe less serious even, than those of the enemies for whom we have contempt. In fact, the number of people in the United States who believe in freedom of the press, I suspect they could fit in somebody's living room, and they would include virtually nobody who's pretending to be outraged by La Prensa. Maybe they could fit in a telephone booth, in fact. Well, we could proceed, but that's one case in point. In fact, coverage of Central American affairs, of which I'll make a couple of comments, that provides almost a textbook example of the propaganda model. It has all the way through the 80s, and it still does. In fact, long before. Let me just briefly review the story, as I think you'll find it if you check. Until the late 1970s, U.S. elite interests were were not at all threatened, really, in Central America. And exactly as the propaganda model would predict, there was virtually no coverage, since there was no need to establish democracy, for example. In fact, you have whatever you like, because we're able to rob the place without any problem. So there's virtually no coverage. Now, there was one exception, one major exception to this, and that was Guatemala. In the early 1950s, as I mentioned before, the U.S. government geared up to overthrow the capitalist democratic government, sort of New Deal-style government of Guatemala, for the interests of the United Fruit Company and other investors. That CIA coup was presented by the government and by the media as an indigenous uprising I'm quoting now, to foil the efforts of the world Bolshevik conspiracy to take over the country. That's Arthur Kroc, the leading thinker of the New York Times at the time. The media spouted a whole variety of idiocies and lies that were concocted by the public relations industry and the government. There's been a regular U.S. intervention ever since, under Kennedy and under Johnson. The United States has regularly intervened to maintain this one of the most murderous states in the world, and to make sure that there's no further threat of democracy there. That's also not a topic for discussion. So I'll just give you one example. About a week ago, March 26th, there was a cover story in the New York Times Magazine by Stephen Kinzer, who knows Guatemala well, I should say, and it's about Guatemala. He concedes in that the democracy in Guatemala is not too attractive, but it's interesting that if you read that whole cover story in the Times, you will not find one word on the U.S. role in terminating Guatemala's democratic interlude 35 years ago, or the murderous interventions ever since. In fact, the only reference to the United States is a kind of a vague reference to the lack of sufficient commitment to our noble ideals in Guatemala. That's pretty impressive, actually, considering the actual historical record, and I should add that that's standard practice. Again, it's not ignorance. Kinzer, before he became a New York Times correspondent, wrote a rather good book about the CIA coup and the U.S. Involvement in turning Guatemala into the charnel house it is and has remained with our help. Well, that was the one exception. However, by the late 1970s, alarm bells were beginning to ring in Washington and New York. The problem was that throughout the whole region, popular organizations were beginning to develop, and there was a crisis of democracy springing up. They were beginning to offer the general population some means, maybe, to escape from the misery and the repression of their ordinary lives, which Gene Kirkpatrick explains to us they don't really mind, because the miseries of ordinary life are perfectly tolerable to these people, as it looks from apartments in Georgetown, apparently. But they were beginning to organize to escape the misery and repression that's so tolerable to them, and to take part in political life. And in Nicaragua, even worse, the tyrant who was the base for U.S. power in the region was overthrown by a popular revolution. Well, concerns mounted as the Sandinistas took power, and despite the enormous destruction of the U.S.-backed war, they began to institute social reforms and development programs, and it looked as if they might be dangerously successful. We go back to the Czar and Woodrow Wilson at this point to understand what the fears were, and Washington and the media reacted exactly as anybody would expect who knows anything about American history, or world history for that matter. The reaction was that in Guatemala, the military regime launched a program of large-scale slaughter. That was supported tacitly during the Carter administration, and it was supported with open enthusiasm under the Reagan administration as the massacre approached a level of near genocide, in fact genocide as the Guatemalan bishops described it, with very heavy reliance on U.S. mercenary states. We have a whole network of states that do our work for us. And the media looked the other way, virtually no discussion. In El Salvador, same thing was beginning to happen for the same reasons, and the media barely noted it. State terror began to rise for the usual reasons in the last year of the Carter administration. The media suppressed it. The first large-scale massacre, big large-scale massacre, was at the River Sumpul in May 1980. That was suppressed. In fact, it was suppressed for about a year and a half. The media also managed to avoid virtually entirely the Honduran refugee camps, which are the obvious place to go to find out what's going on in inner El Salvador, and you get the wrong stories if you go there, so they didn't go. Some people went. A congressional delegation went, breaking the rules, and they discovered that peasants were fleeing, quoting the congressional report, a systematic campaign of terrorism conducted by the U.S.-backed forces, including murder, torture, rape, the burning of crops in order to create starvation conditions, and a program of general terrorism and harassment. That report from Congress passed virtually without notice in the media. You can find something in the local newspapers, like Jerry Studd's local newspaper in Orleans, Massachusetts, is where I read about it, not in the New York Times. In fact, readers were assured at that time that, quoting, there is no real argument that most of the 10,000 political fatalities in 1980 were victims of government forces or irregulars associated with them. That's the Washington Post. The argument, in fact, was not only was completely overwhelming, as was conceded later. There were also extensive reports of extermination of peasants on a massive scale in the foreign press, mainstream foreign press. That was also suppressed. The successor of the assassinated archbishop, later in October 1980, described what he called the war of extermination and genocide against a defenseless civilian population, but the readers of the American press didn't hear that. Rather, they were assured that there's no argument to say that the American supported forces have anything to do with it. Now, there was a period of actual reporting as the terror in El Salvador began to reach the scale and the style of Pol Pot, and that's accurate, under the Reagan administration, particularly when it seemed that the U.S. might be drawn into a conflict that would be harmful to its own interests. So European media coverage of these elections was radically different. There's an interesting study coming along about that. They recognized, almost Western European countries recognized that the elections were just a farce, and they must be when they are conducted in an atmosphere of terror and despair, grisly rumor and macabre reality. That's Lord Chitmas, who observed the elections for the British Parliamentary Human Rights Group. This suppression of public opinion in El Salvador is kind of interesting, actually. It tells you something about American political culture, which is worth thinking about. The United States has unleashed an enormous repressive apparatus and military apparatus in El Salvador. It's poured huge sums of money into the country. If these efforts had even a remote relation to the interests and concerns of the population, then obviously their attitudes would be front-page news, elementary logic. Well, what we discover, however, is that there's no interest in it at all. There's plenty of public opinion information about El Salvador. It's invariably suppressed. Actually, it's misleading to say that it has the wrong message. That's one of the reasons it's suppressed. But suppressed is the wrong word. It's just that it's irrelevant. the irrelevance of the opinion of the people who are subject to our rule is elementary, like the laws of arithmetic. And you don't bother asking the donkeys and the chickens what they think, so who cares what the people think? Notice that that's our attitude. No other explanation for the fact that the opinion of the people who we're saving doesn't matter. For example, the opinion that says 10% of them see a democratic process. You can guess which 10%. There was a Central American Peace Accord in August 1987, the Esquipulas II Accord. After that accord, state terror increased in both Guatemala and El Salvador. These facts were largely suppressed. The assigned task at the time was to concentrate on Nicaraguan failures to live up to the accords, actually alleged failures, and to highlight alleged Sandinistic crimes, which very rarely approached the regular lesser abuses in El Salvador.